Dr. Deemter. Liels prieks redzēt, ka interesi par mākslīgo intelektu, mašīnu, valodu un melošanu vai nepatiesību teikšana ir mūsu vidū dzīva. Un man liels paldies arī jāsaka prezidenta kancelējai un kolēģiem no Datorzinātņu fakultātes, kuri piedalījās un palīdzēja mums šo kārtējo prezidenta lasījumu sērijā prezentējamo lekciju noorganizēt. Mēs esam tikušies ar daudziem ievērojamiem pasaules, varētu teikt, domu veidojošajiem zinātniekiem, politiskiem darbiniekiem, kultūras darbiniekiem, pateicoties šai prezidenta lasījuma sērijai, kura tika uzsākta Valda Zatlera laikā un kura ir ne pārāk bieži, jo labi daudz nevajag, kā mēs zinām, bet tomēr turpinājusies un savu tradīciju uzturējusi. Un šodien šādā veidā mums jau otro reizi šī akadēmiskā gada laikā iznāk saskarties ar tēmu, kas ir saistīta ar viltus ziņām un dažādiem to aspektiem, jo septembrī mums šādu prezidenta lasījumu sērijā iekļautu lekcijas sniedz Aleksandrijas bibliotekas atjaunotājs Ismails Serelgadīns. Un šodien mums ir prieks mūsu vidū sveikt profesoru Kees van Deemter, kurš šobrīd ir Aberdīnas Universitātes profesors, bet drīz, kā jau tas ir, akadēmiskā mobilitāte kustēsies uz Nīderlandi un turpinās savu darbu Utrehtā, bet es ceru, ka tie kontakti, kas ir izveidojušies ar Latvijas Universitātes kognitīvo zinātņu centru un mūsu gan humanitāro, gan datorzinātņu pārstāvjiem turpināsies, un šajā ļoti interesantajā un daudzsološajā laukā mēs vēl daudz dzirdēsim ne tikai par viltus ziņām, bet arī par citām ļoti daudzsološām mākslīgā intelekta attīstības problēmām. So, Kees, I just made a short introduction about the importance of your presence here and the importance of those presidential cycle of lectures. And further on, I shall give you, not for you, but for Jurģis Šilters floor, just for introduction about your academic interests and career. So, Jurģi, lūdzu.
Paldies, godājamais lektors, cienījamās dāmas, godātie kungi, kolēģi un dombiedri. Patiesi gods teikt ievadvārdus valsts prezidentam lekciju ciklu Pasaules līderu lasījumu šodienas referentam, mākslīgā intelekta, datorlingvistikas un datorzinātņu pētniekam profesoram Kēss van Deemteram. Profesora van Deemtera veikums ir unikāls un mākslīgā intelekta pētniecībā netipisks. Parasti mākslīgā intelekta pētnieki ir datorzinātnieku un nereti psihologu, zinātnieku vidū apstrīdēti. Ar profesoru van Deemteru ir savādāk, jo viņa darbs ir augsts novērtēts gan datorzinātnieku, gan psihologu, gan lingvistu, arī matemātisko loģiķu un semantiķu, arī filozofu vidū. Kēss van Deemtera akadēmiskais gājums aizsākās 1991. gadā ar disertāciju par nozīmes kompozīciju, kuru viņš aizstāv Amsterdamas Universitātē. Šī disertācija bija viens no stimuliem loģiski matemātiskai nenoteiktības un daudznozīmības pētniecībai. Gan loģikā, lingvistikā, valodas filozofijā, ja citās nozarēs pēc disertācijas publicēšanas sākās tāds pētniecības uzplaukums. Un pēc disertācijas publicēšanas, kurās, starp citu, man liekas, vienīgā matemātiskās loģikas disertācija, kurā jūs varat atrast citātus uz Johanu Sebastiānu Bachu un ļoti konkrētas norādes arī uz fugām un sonātēm. Seko ilgadīgs darbs Filips pētniecības laboratorijām. Pēc tam Stanforda, Brightona un tagad Aberdīna. Professor van Deemter veikums ir izteikti starpdisciplinārs. Matemātiskā loģika, datorzinātnes, psiholoģija, lingvistika. Ko Kees van Deemters ir izdarījis, kas visticamāk pēc gadiem 50 būs nozīmīgs pienesums pētniecībai? Man varbūt tādas četri pieturas punkti, kas, manuprāt, ir gan nozīmīgi. Pirmkārt, jau disertācijā Kees van Deemters aizsāk daudznozīmīgo loģisko seku jēdzienu izpēti. Tad vienkārši izsakoties loģiski, matemātiski, algoritmiski precīzi runāt par daudznozīmībām, nenoteiktībām, ar kurām ir pilna pasaule, kurā mēs dzīvojam. Mūsdienu starpdisciplinārā daudznozīmības pētniecība lielā mērā ir izveidojusies uz Kees van Deemter pētījumu rezultātiem. Un viņa disertācija, bet, protams, arī daudz citi pētījumi ir iegājuši mūsdienu loģiskās semantikas zelta fondā. Otrkārt, gribētu teikt, ka pētījums, kuru Kees van Deemters publicēja 98. gadā žurnālā Journal of Semantics par daudznozīmību un idiosinkrātisko interpretāciju ir lielā mērā katalizējis pētniecību komunikācijas zinātnēs. Tātad šajā rakstā viņš matemātiski precīzi formulē vienu no cilvēku komunikācijas pamatprincipiem. Tā saucamo idiosinkrātiskās komunikācijas principu, saskaņā ar kuru cilvēki spēja veiksmīgi sazināties, pat ja viens otru vēstījumu saprot atšķirīgi. Saziņas partneri bieži vien pat neapjauš, ka viņu interpretācijas atšķirās. Idiosinkrātiskās interpretācijas princips šai parādībai piedāvā precīzu skaidrojumu un ir kalpojis par daudz pētījumu pamatu gan komunikācijas zinātnēs, gan lingvistikā, gan arī datorzinātnēs. Trešais lielais pienesums profesora Kees van Deemter darbības laikā ir norādošo izteikumu pētniecība. Un šeit savijās viens no tiem jaukajiem gadījumiem, ko mēs varam redzēt, tātad loģiski matemātiskā zinātnes no vienas puses, arī humanitārā zinātnes, sociālās zinātnes, kuras veiksmīgi savijās vienā fascinējošā pētniecības virzienā, tātad norādošie izteikumi un kopīgās zināšanas. It kā ir pašsaprotami mums kā ikdienas, kā dabiskās valodas lietotājiem, bet šīs kopīgās zināšanas, kas ir pamats, kāpēc mēs spējam sazināties, viņas ir ārkārtīgi sarežģīti atveidojamas formālās sistēmās un formālās valodās. Un patiesībā, ja tas jautājums, kas ir lielākais izaicinājums vai viens no lielākajiem izaicinājumiem mākslīgā vai intelekta pētniecībā, tad tas ir darbs pie šīm kopīgajām zināšanām. Un atkal jāsaka, ka pēdējo gadu 20 laikā veikti pētījumi profesora van Deemter pētniecības komandā ir būtiski pavirzījuši uz priekšu šo pētniecības virzienu. Un ceturtais pienesums pētniecībai dažādās nozarēs atkal ir par attēlu un teksta tulkojamību, attēlu un tekstu miedarbību, respektīvi par multimodālās uztveres un multimodālās skaidrošanas jautājumiem, arī dokumentu automatizētu analīzi. Šis ir veikums, kas ir arī mūsdienu zinātnes zelta fondā. Faktiski, ja mēs vēlamies pētīt teksta attēla miedarbību, tad Kees van Deemter pētījums mēs nevaram apiet. Vienkārši ir pārāk centrāli šajā visā. Gribētu arī uzsvērt, ka profesors van Deemters ir vairāk industriālu patentu autors, ar būtisku nozīmi tautsaimniecībā. Viņš ir autors dialogu sistēmām, cilvēka datoru miedarbības automatizētām sistēmām ar daudziem industriāliem pielietojumiem. Noslēdzot papildus daudzām 150 publikācijām augsti ieteikums faktoru izdevumos. Papildus visam šim, Kees van Dēmters ir autors vairākām monogrāfijām, gribētu dažas no viņām norādīt, kopā ar amerikāņu lingvistu Stanley Peters 96. gadā publicēja monogrāfiju par semantisko daudznozīmību un nespecifikāciju, kur publicēja Stanfordas Universitātes izdevniecībā ļoti bieži citētu arī datorlingvistu vidū. Tad 2002. gadā kopā ar Rodžeru Kibli rakstu krājumu kolektīvu monogrāfiju par dalīšanos informācijā vai informācijas dalīšanu, arī Stanfordas Universitātes izdevniecībā. Un ir arī autors grāmatai par aptuvenību, ar nosaukumu Neprecīzi, slavējot aptuvenību, kas publicēta 2010. gadā Oksfordas Universitātes izdevniecībā un ir viens no standarta materiāliem, ja mūs interesē aptuvenības pētniecība. Un visbeidzot, 2016. gadā Kees van Dēmters publicē grāmatu par attiecinošo izteikumu skaitļošanas modeļiem, kas ir savukārt publicēta Massachusetts Tehnoloģijas institūta izdevniecībā. Abas šīs grāmatas abas pēdējās monogrāfijas ir augsts novērtētas dažādu zinātņu griezumā un ir būtisks pamats mūsdienu pētniecībā šajās jomās. Un vēl gribētu arī teikt, ka Kees van Dēmters ir viens no retajiem kolēģiem, kurš ir gandrīz visos nozīmīgajos kognitīvo zinātņu, psiholoģijas un datorlingvistikas periodisko izdevumu redkolēģijās. Tāds rēts gadījums, es vēl pārskatīju profesoru dzīves gājumu, pārsteidzoši, ka arī visi tie augsts ieteikums izdevumi žurnāli ir tādi, kur vai nu redakcijas kolēģijā, vai nu viens no asociētajiem redaktoriem. Un ar to es gribētu arī manus ievadvārdus noslēgt un gribu pateikties atbalstam šo lasījumu veidošanā, Luminoru ziedojumam un Latvijas Universitātes fonda atbalstam un protams, sadarbības partneriem Accenture Latvija. Un ar to tad arī dotu vārdu profesoram Keesam van Deemteram. I'm pleased to give the floor to Professor Kees van Deemter, who will tell about lying and all these issues from the perspective of computational linguist and expert in artificial intelligence.
Thank you very much. I'm really humbled by the invitation to speak in this distinguished lecture series, and very pleased with the introductions, very kind words, a good percentage of which I even understood. So I followed how Jürgis took you through parts of my life, and that was interesting to guess at what he was saying. Thank you very, very much, both of you. So yes, let's talk a little bit about lying, embarrassing though it might be to make that the topic of a talk, with the specific perspective of the area of my current research, which is natural language generation. And of course I'll tell you all about what that is. And I should mention that a lot of this work is joint work with Professor Eyud Reiter, who's also at Aberdeen. I'll highlight his contributions here and there. So one way to sort of introduce the general topic is by talking about fake news. We all know sort of what that is, don't we? News reports that are deliberately untruthful. They are often spread via social media, blogs, or news, often for political or commercial gain. And sort of the classic example that most people agree about is the birther myth, which asserted that President Obama was not born in the USA and therefore, etc., not a legitimate president. And you can get the drift of what people were after with that. Let's take that as a prototype of fake news. Now, as you may know, a lot of people in computer science see this as a very interesting computational challenge. Let's design algorithms that automatically catch fake news, detect articles where people do their best to lie, do their best to say things that aren't true for an ultimate gain. There's even just recently a new international challenge was launched in which everyone is sort of invited to submit their algorithms to solve that problem. My talk will cast doubt on that enterprise. I'm not going to say that it can't be done. I will say that we have to be very cautious not to expect too much from that approach. We'll examine the idea of lying. What is it? How does it come about? And please indulge me when I say lying, I mean something slightly more general perhaps, deviating from the truth, okay? That's what I call lying today. There's a lot of work on this in linguistics and philosophy, of course, also in game theory, and of course in law and ethics. My approach will be a little bit different. My approach today will be basically that of an engineer, strange though that might sound. What we'll do, namely, is I'll talk you through the general architecture, the general structure of a typical natural language generation, NLG, program, and I'll highlight several junctures where it is very easy to get things wrong, or at least to say things that are highly debatable. And of course, the underlying hypothesis then will be that when humans speak, they are faced with the same issues. So, one way to think about my talk is offering two things, or trying to offer two things. One is a sort of new insight into lying and untruthful speaking. The other is simply to inform you a little bit about a hot new area of computer science, which is NLG. What are NLG systems? Systems, broadly, that convert data into text. Some examples. Automated weather reports. So in a talk yesterday, we were talking about that quite at length. Input is large tables with temperature at different places and times, wind speeds and all that. Output is just an ordinary weather report like you may be getting on the news. A lot of work in that area. Robot journalism, for the moment mostly in sports. When you now read a sports report on the BBC or something like that, a brief report about a football match, there is a significant chance that what you'll be reading is composed by a computer. Environmental reports. People in Aberdeen have tagged particular birds, rare birds, tagged with sensors so that the computer always knows where they are. And from that data, together with other data, a map obviously, and the weather, stuff like that, they generate little stories about what this bird has been doing yesterday. That's the third item there. Now the fourth item is the item I want to talk with you much more about today. Medical shift reports, okay? So a nurse or a doctor who is sitting at the cot of a very sick baby and who after 45 minutes or an entire night hands over to the next doctor or the next nurse. They write down what's happened with the baby. This is what we're trying to automate. We'll get there in a bit. I just want to fly the flag a little bit for this area, NLG, because it's now really growing. my colleagues, including Aod Reiter, have founded a spin-out company, Area NLG, and that's just one among a number of new players in that field, which is growing so rapidly that Forbes, last year in January, when they made up a list of the 10 hottest AI technologies, they didn't just include NLG, it was the number one item on their list. That was Forbes magazine. Other similar sources are starting to say the same. Yesterday we were talking a little bit how these algorithms can teach you something about language. Let's not say very much more about that. Let's today focus much more on the practical side of things. What we're talking about, broadly speaking, is you start from data, from meaning, and you express that in text. That's NLG. So don't confuse it with going from a text, right, to get information out of that text. That's something else. It's natural language understanding, natural language processing, whatever you want to call it. So it's the stuff on the right that we're doing today. Why is it hard? Well, broadly, because you have to make all these choices. How to express this information in words. And surprisingly, perhaps, although linguists have a lot to say about these issues, they're very far from having solved them. My main source of examples today will be a project called Baby Talk, which is about babies in intensive care. It was a project between the Universities of Aberdeen and Edinburgh, involving a lot of my colleagues in Aberdeen. The input is a lot of data about a baby in a cot, 24/7. I'll tell you a little bit more about the nature of that data in a minute. There's so much of that data that doctors find it very difficult to make sense of all of that, because ideally they would have to pay attention continually. When I say shift reports, there are different kinds of shift reports with different audiences. Today we'll focus mostly on 45-minute reports for clinicians, nurses, doctors. It's called BT Nurse. Every now and then, I'll also say something about text produced not for clinicians, but for the parents of the baby. Parents and wider family and friends, the clan, so to speak, which is why this is called BT Clan. We need a little bit of medical jargon that comes with the area. So SATs are oxygen saturation levels. BP is blood pressure. HR is heart rate. Bradycardia is a complicated concept to do with heart rate that is too slow. Too slow for too long. It's not good for you. Okay? Bradycardia. To allow you a little bit more easily to link to this initial topic of fake news, I will regularly also give examples from economics. Just bear in mind, this is something we built. We did not build a system for economics. So these are all the sites where there were sensors. So for example, temperature is measured in two places, and presumably the difference between the two temperatures can often be significant. There is blood pressure is being measured, lots and lots of different things, okay? The heart rate is measured, obviously, HR. And here you see the principal means of communication until very recently in the hospital. This is what a doctor would be looking at. So what you see here is at the top, you see HR, heart rate, you see oxygen level, below that ox, see lots of different things. The details don't matter particularly. Just note the red stuff at the bottom. These are interventions, okay? So the baby is turned, perhaps, or they get oxygen because their oxygen saturation is not enough. That sort of thing, that's the red stuff. So there's continuous information and discrete information. And here you see how that information usually is passed on. If you look very closely, you see this little red ball there. That's the head of the baby. Surrounded by a lot of technology, as you can see. And here you see at the bottom a typical shift report written by a nurse. Just look at it for a second, just to give you a sense of how people write about this. There's a lot of information in ordinary English. Of course, you could also design systems like this for other languages, but we focus on English today. At the top, you see what, at some stage of its development, the BT45, the BT nurse system made of this. So the top bit was generated by a computer. Okay? So by 11 o'clock, the baby had been handbagged, a technical term for something that they do to the baby, I think to do with oxygen, etc. Okay? Fairly technical language. After all, this is for doctors and nurses. Now, how is a system like this constructed? Typically, it contains 4 components: signal analysis, data interpretation, content determination, and saying it in English. Okay? Linguistics for you and me. Let's talk about these 4 components a little bit. So, mind you, I'm not going to tell you about the details of those algorithms, okay? That's not what today is about. Today, in my mind, is about the what and not about the how. If we were to talk about the how of those 4 stages, we would have to talk about machine learning, we would have to talk about medical insights that are hand-coded into rules, right? And how the 2 kinds of information are combined. But again, that's not what we'll do today. 1, signal analysis. That's a collection of basically mathematical tools without any medical knowledge. Okay? It's about detecting trends in the data, patterns and events. So, for example, blood oxygen rising, or a downward spike in heart rate. Also part of signal analysis is separating real data from artifacts. So, for example, you may have noticed in the graph that in the SO values you get suddenly 0 values. Also at the top, oxygen sometimes goes to 0. You better not believe that that's true, okay? So part of the first batch of tasks is to filter out that kind of nonsensical data and try to replace it by more truthful data. Second stage, more interesting, I think. It's about detecting higher level events, the sort of things that matter for doctors. So, such as a bradycardia, which we were talking about a minute ago, right? Slow heartbeat. Or here is a sensor that is flapping against the skin of the baby. These things happen because there's wind flow in the cot. So these, right? It's not medically very important, and precisely for that reason you need to know, oh, this is not about the baby, it's about the wind flow, etc. What this means is that this second stage of data interpretation involves all kinds of medical knowledge, right? What's the healthy range for heart rate? Where does it get too slow? Is there wind flow in the, etc.? But there's more in data interpretation. So, in particular, causality. So, if you look at the shift reports, you'll find sentences such as, blood oxygen level falls, therefore O2 value in the incubator is increased, right? Something's done not just, but it's done for a reason. Heart rate up because the baby is being handled. Again, right? Causality. They say that the heart rate goes up as a consequence of the fact that the baby has been, right? Where does the system get that? The only thing that the sensors give you is heart rate and that event of turning the baby. Causality? Where's that? Mind you, that this is a very good example why textual summaries can be so useful, more useful than the simple graph, right? Because certainly the graph doesn't tell you. Moving on to the third class of things that the system has to do. The system has to determine what of all this is important enough to communicate. So, for example, what's clinically relevant to know? What do parents want to know, right? Contrasting these two systems, BT nurse and BT clan. And of course, all this depends on the purpose and the text of and the context of the text, how much time is there available, and there are all kinds of technical constraints. For example, if you decide to talk about a certain detail, you better also say enough so that that detail is understood. People interested in linguistics and language may have waited for this slide and maybe sort of disappointed at its brevity. But that's the brevity of this event rather than anything else, because there's so much here. Saying it in English, okay? So we tend to distinguish at least 4 phases. The first phase involves questions about how shall we order things, right? Do we want to go through these 45 minutes chronologically? Yeah, you can do that. But you could also start with the single thing that's most important. Or you could always have the same thematic ordering. First heart rate, then, okay? Different ways to structure your information. Second, more low-level linguistic decisions. Do we make this sentence an active or a passive? Right? Lots of different low-level decisions like that to be taken. Referring expressions generation. So when you talk about a time, for example, do you want to give a number? Or do you want to relate it to another event, saying after intubation? Right? 2 very different ways of talking about a time. Finally, lexical choice, right? When everything else has been decided and you are still wondering whether to say bradycardia or slow heart rate, right? You need to make that choice. Probably depending on your audience, right? And there's lots more like that. So, for example, if you've decided to name the time by a number, are you going to round or not? Lots of decisions like this. So, far too briefly, 4 types of linguistic decisions. So, if we look at all that, right? So this was a tutorial, an ultra-brief tutorial on NLG, right? Nothing about lying. But you can look at that structure, you can look at those 4 stages and ask, right, so where can it go wrong? What types of deviations from the truth can arise and why? Let's go through them one by one again. So remember signal analysis, deciding things like, is there a spike in heart rate? Or are there perhaps 2 spikes? Or none at all? Here is an example in economics, just to sort of broaden a little bit and make you realize that this is not specifically about medicine. I found this graph on the web which is about volatility in the stock market, very important for investors, right? So here, the maker of this graph has decided that spikes are about, being 20% above a 10-day average, right? So there's a 10-day window, and then are you 20% above the average over that window? That gives you all those little circles, those are your spikes. But of course, there are different views. You might say, perhaps this is one big spike, right? That's an entirely legitimate view. That's the view that you get if you take a larger time window. Now, which of the two should an investor know, right? What's meaningful? I don't know. I don't know about economics. It's the same in medicine. 1 spike, 3 spikes, etc. Okay. A notion like bradycardia, again, is unfortunately theory-laden. It's differently defined now than 10 years ago, and 10 years from now it will be defined yet different again. It's a complicated notion. It's about how slow is too slow, for how long, and for whom. We're talking about babies that are at very different stages of their premature development. So of course, heart rates, right, need to be judged differently according to who you're talking about. So this is a highly theory-laden notion. In other words, to say there's a bradycardia here, or there were 2 bradycardias here, is not necessarily the truth, even if you're trying hard to say the truth. Okay, economics again, full of cases like that. The Thatcher government in the UK is famous for redefining the notion of unemployment 17 times. Of course, they did this fully trying to serve the truth and nothing else. Who am I to doubt them? But it does show that there's a certain subjectivity involved, isn't there? The same for notions like recession. Okay, here you see again a part of what was written by a nurse over a 45 period. You see notions, sentences like the baby has needed up to 80% oxygen to keep the blood saturation values up, right? What you see there is how problematic causality is, right? Those of you who know about philosophy of science and topics like that know that causality is a highly problematic concept. When you read in the newspaper that a certain gene causes whatever disease, you should always take that with a pinch of salt, because probably the gene just increases your chance of getting the disease by a certain percentage, which may be very moderate, right? Still, we talk about that as causation, right? So certainly since David Hume, we know that causality is a very difficult concept. The problem is that by simply leaving it out of the text, we're not doing anything good either. Because if you remove every sentence like this, or every causal hint, you're left with a bunch of unconnected sentences that are very difficult to make sense of. We, including doctors and nurses, are wired to see connections and think in terms of needs and addressing those needs and consequences and trying to fight those, right? All of that is about causality and reason. Same, of course, in economics. So you might read a newspaper report saying that the interest rate rise caused exports to fall, right? But that causation is not in their data. Still talking about the same type of error that can sneak in very easily and automatically, even if you're completely honest. And a bit more subtly than before, perhaps, content determination. So suppose you have isolated a bradycardia. It's a bradycardia, no doubt about it. Still, there is a question, do you want to burden the reader with telling them that? Is it important enough, right? So, of course, all kinds of medical knowledge comes into play here. Is it important for clinical decisions, etc.? Economics, similar issues. Giving a very different kind of example, company year report, all kinds of numbers, the usual thing, but now suppose there's a big fraud investigation against a part of the company, which could have huge financial consequences. Mention it or not, right? That's not completely obvious. Furthermore, still, right, going through that architecture again, going through those different stages again of an LG system, choosing words. When nurses talk about bradycardias, they also add words like significant, right? Or slight, vague words, which, unlike bradycardia, don't have completely crisply defined definitions, right? SATs have remained okay. When is it still okay? So the same issues are at play in lexical choice. Finally, another example of lexical choice. Remember how to talk about a number, rounding it or not, again, can introduce debate. If I say that something happened at 11, and in fact it happened at 2 minutes before 11, am I lying? Am I giving you the truth? It depends on whether those 2 minutes matter. And this is not always an obvious thing. Even more subtly, looking at those linguistic decisions, right, again, juxtaposition. If we say something like A happened following B, right? For example, oxygen level rose after the baby was turned. I'm saying just after. I'm not expressing causality. Am I maybe hinting at it? Might you read it into the text, even though I didn't willingly put it there? That also might happen, right? So this is at a slightly subtler level than before. It's almost about misunderstandings, right? So similarly, take a sentence like there, brief coughing episodes and bradycardias were observed. That's a slightly sloppy sentence, because how do the brackets go? So clearly, the coughing episodes were brief. Were the bradycardias brief as well? It's not clear whether that's what I'm saying. So again, very accidentally, by making sentences, I may be thinking that I write a clear sentence, but you may get something different out of it than I put in. Okay, you wouldn't call that lying, would you? But it is in that same area of, saying something that might raise misunderstandings and might be debatable. Right. So all of those issues are examples of accidentally getting it wrong or getting it debatable. Of course, there is more. Sometimes we tell a white lie. And it's interesting because you can illustrate that so well with NLG. And there's another system, for example, the STOP system, which was designed to help people stop smoking. These are people who told their doctor that they want smoking, and NLG systems design letters tailored exactly to them, explaining to them that in your situation, now you need to do that, that'll help you a little bit, and most people who try this succeed. Good, right? But what if most people do not succeed? Do you want to tell the patient or not? Do you want not patient? the smoker. Right? So low probabilities of success, it's not clear whether you should mention that or not. Right? So what we're entering here also is this territory of lying by omission. Right? By not saying something, are you, okay? Almost lying. Certainly deviating from the truth and the full truth. Another source of these examples, the BT clan system, right? For the wider clan around the baby. So here's a very sick grandmother. Are you going to tell her that the baby is now going through a very risky period? Maybe not. Right? These are the actual decisions that my colleagues had to make for the system, right? Because it was tried out in earnest with all the ethics issues that raises. Yesterday we talked briefly about another example of this kind of phenomenon, very different. When you describe a geographical area, you're almost always slightly incorrect. If these are all the dots on the map of Scotland where snow is predicted for the coming night, then no brief description of that area will get the area exactly right. The best you can do is get it only a little bit wrong. If you do that, are you lying? Well, you get my drift. Finally, there are, of course, situations where people are really taking advantage. This is what we usually mean by lying, right? Saying something, knowing full well that it's wrong and you could have done better, okay? Even that applies in NLG systems. So there's a system, Karamini and Moore 2006, which described houses to buyers, and they focus on the positives of the house. You see the problem. Etc. The following example is another BT clan example with leaving out information when talking to a relative. Very, very similar. The only difference is that here what you're doing is not in the interest of the person you talk to, the wider clan member. It is in the interest, though, of the parents, because they don't want visits at a particular moment. So if we step back now a little bit, right? So going towards the end of what I have to say, you see a number of patterns here, right? You can see that a deviation may be intended or not, and probably in most cases it's absolutely not intended. Furthermore, when you deviate from the truth, you can do that by saying something incorrect or by leaving something important out. Thirdly, when you deviate from the truth, there's a why to it, right? Do you do it automatically? You can't help yourself, so unavoidable? Or do you do it for the hearer, a white lie? Or do you do it in your own interest? And of course, with the growing commercial popularity of NLG, that is a big issue. Think of the selling houses example. Okay, so very broadly, unavoidable errors, we've seen lots of them. Debatable definitions, simplifications, and honest errors. Slightly less bad, perhaps, unavoidable partial information, right, where you're incomplete. So you have to sometimes leave out important stuff because you don't have the time or the space to be complete. Unavoidable in the hearer's interest, you can be incorrect, for example, when you know that the truth will hurt the hearer, or you can give partial information, incomplete information, for the same reason. And then finally, you can make these errors, you can deviate from the truth in your own interest and either be partial or incorrect. Now, if we look at that battlefield, then one way to look at it is to say, wait, when we speak, basically we act, don't we? such a thing as speech act theory, which looks at communication in exactly that way. So NLG systems do exactly that. They have to choose between different actions, and each action is saying something. What this suggests is that you can use simple versions of game theory to make your system choose. Game theory has looked at lying for a long time, in fact since its inception in 1944. Now, initial versions of, old versions of game theory typically were adversarial, right? Like countries fighting each other. But game theory has developed into something much broader, which can also shed light on collaboration. For example, linguistic collaboration, which you can think about in the following terms. So this is the Crawford and Sobel model, which is quite old already. So think about it in the following way, a bit abstractly. As a speaker, you have a certain amount of information. So there are different contents, if you like, that you have at your disposal. From that, you choose a particular form, like a sentence or a text, to express it. Hearers, when they get one of these forms, decide upon an action, right? They do something with it. Think of an action as, it can be anything. It could be simply a state of mind, or it could actually be something like stopping with smoking. Now, the model goes on to say that every action is associated with a utility, right? An action can be good or bad. But importantly, it can be good or bad for the speaker, it can be good or bad for the hearer. Now, let's simplify a little bit, because most NLG systems try to benefit the hearer. In other words, the interests of the speaker and the hearer coincide. So we have just one function there at the bottom. So imagine this problem, right? In the stop smoking example again, letters for people who want to stop smoking. And suppose that form 1, so one text of the letter, says everything it needs to say, and then also tells the patient that unfortunately he's rather unlikely to stop. Okay? Form 2 withholds that last bit of information. Which should we choose, right? The problem, of course, is that the effect of these letters on the smoker are not known with any certainty, right? So you have to throw in probabilities, which you have to get from somewhere. And of course then the name of the game is to choose that utterance that maximizes utility. Right? So suppose, for example, that if you choose form 1, text 1 if you like, then it's completely certain what the hearer will do, just for simplicity, right? They keep smoking, right? After all, you give them this information that's probably not going to help them anyway, okay? Form 2, there's the uncertainty, right? The hearer might respond either with action 2 or action 3. So action 2 might be, for example, to stop smoking. Action 3 might be to keep smoking, and what's worse, also lose faith in the doctors, right? Those are broadly the two outcomes in this situation. And we choose the first as slightly more likely than the second. Whether that's the case is a matter for empirical research. All right. So what we now need is information about utility. We need to know how good is it when the smoker quits smoking for a certain period of time? How bad is it when they keep smoking and lose faith? I've just made up the numbers, right? Presumably, of course, the last action, action 3, has a lower value, is a worse outcome than if they stop smoking, right? And then what you need to do to get the expected utility is to weigh those two utilities with their likelihoods, right? And because we assume that this positive response by the smoker is a little bit more likely than the negative response, we get an outcome 0.58, which is a little bit higher than what would have happened had you been completely honest, right? So if all the assumptions underlying this very simple model are true, then you better speak the full truth. Okay, stepping back for the last time. NLG systems are an emerging class of language technology systems that I think will have a profound impact on society. We've talked about medical applications and very quickly about a few others. Yesterday we've talked about NLG algorithms as models of human activity. In both cases, we are at risk also of producing falsehoods, as we've seen. Our analysis suggests that if you ask what does it really mean to speak truthfully, then unfortunately deviating from the truth, or at least deviating from being certain that you speak the truth, or that it will be understood correctly also by the hearer, that's unavoidable, right? It's a trap that you can't always avoid. There are also situations where that can even be beneficial for the hearer, although, of course, of particularly worth looking out for is situations where this is not the case, where the speaker has an ulterior motive trying to benefit themselves, for example, in e-commerce systems, or out of political malice. So, back to fake news. There are, of course, and I should stress that, patent falsehoods, right? Yes, it's quite conceivable to make computer programs that check facts and that say, okay, this article asserts that Obama was not born in the US. In fact, he was. This is incorrect, and it's central to the thesis of the article, so it's fake, right? Conceivable, people work on that sort of thing. On the other hand, the analysis of today shows that truthfulness is not a very well-defined concept, right? I've shown you lots of examples where if we took a vote, you wouldn't be unanimously saying this is truthful or this is not truthful. I'm absolutely certain about that. And that means that you shouldn't expect too much from technical solutions, right? Because if we don't know what truthfulness is, we can't make a computer program that detects it. I have to make one small exception. I think there is future in making systems that allow you to drill down a little bit into what is said. Imagine a text that's being generated for you and it says the baby had a slight bradycardia last night. Click on it and the system tells you how bradycardia was defined, where they got that definition, and what they meant by slight. Right? That would, I think, be a step forward. It would not be what most people think about in this area, but it is something that can be done. So if the future is not to these technological solutions for fake news, then where is it? I think there's a very important space there for public education about science, trying to explain to the wider audience how we work, how notions like bradycardia again, or recession or unemployment can be defined in different ways, and that you could give different views on society depending on which view you take. All of that, reading skills, statistical skills, and of course, the sorts of issues that in a previous presidential lecture took center stage when Professor Sarah Geldin spoke about public institutions and courage. So that is what I have to say about NLG and about the modest contribution that thinking about NLG can make when you're interested in fighting fake news.
So thank you very much for this talk, and I even mentioned that in the discussion slide 2 you have placed such a sort of vague statement that speaking truth is often how it was. May we get back to this discussion slide?
Well, not well defined. Is that what you, not a well-defined concept?
Not still some slide back. Yeah. Deviating from truth is often unavoidable. So often is apparently such a vague statement. If we just omit it, we can say that deviating from the truth is unavoidable. Is it closing to the essence? Because if we get back to one Russian poet from Silver Age, I believe it was Tucher, who said that every outspoken word, or every word outspoken, is lies. Are we getting closer to the topic, or are we really possibly our human essence is just hiding our thoughts under our words? No, it was just such my, let's say, rather not a question but comment, and not taking into consideration this statement that deviating from truth is unavoidable. I would like to say that we are truly thankful for your wonderful presentation, and we still have a bit of time to ask questions to you. So, Lutz.
Janis Kajic from the President's Office. I was very interested in what you said about utility and the fact that you didn't mention morality within that, because as I'm sure you're aware, but maybe everyone isn't, utility and utilitarianism is a difficult concept. The old reductio ad absurdum argument used to be, if you want to stop parking offences, you introduce the death penalty for parking offences, and they will stop. When it comes to the medical profession, it is even more difficult because, for instance, for prostate cancer, certainly a few years ago, it could be said that the likely time of to death is equal whether treatment is administered or not. And that may be true for other types of cancer as well. But if treatment is administered, then the quality of life for the patient rapidly decreases. Therefore, it is a very awkward decision. Now, if we are talking about different types of cancers or other diseases where, in fact, treatment is very unlikely to be successful but destroys the quality of life of what is left, then utility, of course, would play a part, and you would say, well, the patient shouldn't be told, or the medical profession should be told, the clan should not be told, because it's not in their interest to know. But that is very arguably an amoral decision. Now, how would you deal with this, or have you within your research even, have you had reason to look at this question? Thank you.
Utility is a very dangerous concept when misapplied, when too narrowly applied. It's like with all these metrics, like the metrics of our performance, looking at H scores and all that, right? When you have a metric, it had better be a good one. So, for example, I would propose that looking at the situation of traffic transgressions and the death penalty, we also, within the notion of utility, we include something like, is it perhaps a bad thing for society to kill people systematically, right? I would regard that as having a rather low utility myself. Of course, what this also means is that the utility of an action also is debatable, right? So I'm a little bit facile, perhaps, putting those numbers there, because where on earth am I getting them from? How do I know how bad it is for a person to lose faith in the medical system, right? Or in their doctors, right? I need to know that to get those numbers. I'm just pointing a direction there, right? In principle, I believe that medics can investigate issues like that. If a person loses faith in the medical system, what are the consequences? They might go to the doctor less quickly the next time, and they might then, right, their health might suffer. I think the same direction of response, if I understood your second example well, the prostate cancer example, I think the same way of looking at it applies. I wouldn't like a narrow metric that only looks at survival rates or survival times. I would definitely want to look at quality of life as well. I think this is quite accepted in the healthcare profession. So yes, when utilities are too narrow, I would rather certain policymakers not seeing those slides.
So I saw there was some other question. Yeah, on this side.
Hi, thanks for your lecture. My name is David, I'm from the United States, and I had a question about, you talked about algorithms detecting fake news, and I was thinking a bit more about, well, of course, the concept of what is fake or truthful or untruthful is a bit wishy-washy, but how do we, would perhaps algorithms be better suited to look for fallacious logic, not necessarily this is true or this is false, but this conclusion is not implied given the premises. So I think you could use a computer to look at something like an appeal to authority or an appeal to nature much more easily than this binary of true or false. And do you have something to say about that?
Yeah, very good point, very good point. I think a modest example of what you're saying is checking whether the title of a news article captures its content. Does the title actually follow from the content? If it doesn't, right, then the title misleads, right? So yes, in principle, yes, right? Now, two remarks about that. One is that means we have to generalize the notion of logical consequence in such a way that it applies to vague statements as well, right? We have to determine whether from certain data it follows that there was a bradycardia. Sorry that I stick with that one example, but I think that, right, you will understand that any other example would do just the same, but just for simplicity, right? So classical logic, of course, looks at statements that are true or false, and the statements that we're seeing here in these reports often can be characterized in that way. So that's my first remark, but the second remark, which you probably know was coming, yes, so there is a new line of research which takes a sort of empirical approach to logical consequence in text. Textual entailment is the term that people use. So they use statistical methods for finding out whether, given certain sentences, some other sentence can reasonably thought to follow. So yes, that could apply, and that's perhaps a very worthwhile direction of research. Yeah.
Yes, please, question over there.
Hello, my name is Gins. You mentioned there is two main disciplines, like natural language understanding, which translates text to meaning, and then natural language generation, which generates text from the meaning. But isn't there also a large topic about how you actually encode the meaning? Is there? How do you encode the meaning? Isn't that also a large topic that can create very different approaches for both understanding and generating language?
Yes, that is a big research topic. So in general, yes, there's a long tradition of research using simpler or more complicated logics to encode the meaning in a text. Yes. At the moment, the success of that line of research, in terms of practical terms, right? Can we apply those formalisms to really figure out what a text means, to say whether two texts mean the same or whether one thing follows from another, right? That success is at the moment still very, very limited, right? As you probably know, the tendency is to move towards very simple representation systems such as AMR, for example, which give you only a little part of the information in a text, right? Basically, as triples like A is greater than B, or right, that kind of stuff, stripping away quantifiers and right, modals and right, that sort of thing. If that is your input, if that is what you generate sentences from, it's a very difficult problem, because from there you never get the complicated sentences that these nurses write. It's a huge gap to be bridged there between current knowledge representation and what medical professionals want to write when they write about a baby. So, yeah, very interesting research, but quite far removed from building practical systems.
Thank you. Any other question, please? Yes, the first row.
Hello. Are there any advantages to generating medical reports in natural language as opposed to just simple logs made out of predefined sentences that are so simple that there's basically no room for ambiguity or other artifacts? Surely trained doctors should be able to navigate that and understand what it means.
I don't know. I know about the history of this project. They started out with an experiment in which they showed doctors of different levels of experience and nurses. They showed them either a graph or a text. And they made sure that the texts were such that they could be automatically generated. And they tried to find out what worked best for a doctor. The metrics that they used were based on the quality of the decisions that a doctor reading these things would make. And there were other doctors rating the decisions. So you could say, how often does this doctor get it right? And then you can compare how often do they get it right when they read text, how often do they get it right when they read a graph, right? And what they found was that text can do rather well, okay? Much better than graphs. Depends a little bit. So this was certainly the case for the more experienced doctors and for the nurses. For some reason, the junior doctors were somewhere in the middle. So they did rather well with the graphs. Anyway, the question is whether the truncated text that you're thinking about, where everything debatable has been stripped away, would they also be useful? Or are we then basically getting down to the same functionality as the graphs, where it's perhaps better to look at the graph? Right? If all you do is say things like heart rate was this, heart rate was that, a minute later, right? That's a list of data, and I'd rather look at a graph. So you need a higher level view of some sort, and as soon as you get that, then one by one, these issues come into play. Because you're going to omit things, you're going to use higher level terms like bradycardia or, okay, recession or unemployment, and back are your problems again. I'm not saying that some form of controlled language couldn't be useful. I just am not sure.
So we still have one question. Time for one question. Of course, I believe there would be much more, but please, the last question.
Hi. In your speech, you mostly talked about the situation where you have a data set and you parse it into readable language. But when I try to, like, the most annoying thing about fake news is that actually you have this article, but I'm usually too lazy to go look at the data set and to check like simple things like whether it's a reliable source or does the data actually support evidence, or which might be even more harder, is there any like omissions that could an algorithm at least like do that for me? I don't want to check the data set, but can the algorithm parse the news article and see if the data actually supports what it says?
Well, aren't we then getting into exactly these problems? So I concede that there will be cases where automatically you can compare the text to the data and say, here the text says something that's false. Text says Obama born Kenya or something like that. In fact, he was born somewhere else, right? But the point is that if you only catch those glaring mistakes, you're probably only going to filter out a small minority of the text. We looked at some examples in the news, and very often the lying is a lot more subtle. You can often not really point your finger on a downright falsehood. It is often in suggesting causality, right? Two things are happening at the same time. Now, don't you understand that, right? That sort of thing.
Well, that and... for example, if they use data sets that are, the research arm of Breitbart versus the American census and stuff like that, whether the algorithm can actually judge how far this data is like removed from, like for example in polls, like the Fox polls were always, during the presidential election, the Fox polls were always slanted one way or the other.
I'm not sure what you're driving at. So you want to compare the actual numbers in an election with the projected numbers? That can be done.
There's usually more than one data set for a given question. Like the presidential election, there were many different polls, and if there's one that derives conclusions from one particular especially sample data set, it's a lot of work for me to check all of them. But for an algorithm, it can see, okay, yellow flag, this data set is so far deviated from the mean of all the others.
Right. So I think you're in the ballpark of the Obama birther myth. Essentially, you're pointing at a situation where someone, for example, omits important information that's so evidently of the same level of something that they do talk about. That could be caught, yes. Perhaps I've emphasized too much what cannot be done. Of course, a lot of things can be done. Yes, checking sources. Are sources mentioned in the first place, right? Or is it always anonymous? When a poll is cited, how about other polls? Of course, a lot can be done.
So, thank you very much, Professor Deemter, for your very interesting and fascinating talk. We all know that the mission of academia is the pursuit of truth, and now we learned that it's very difficult to express it in words. Thank you very much. We shall try our best.